But now we're going to end with probably the most damaging stuff. Here we go. This is stuff no one's heard except for... In 1970, in Germany, a man named Gunther Luling was doing his doctoral thesis on the Qur'an. He could read and write Arabic, Aramaic, Nabatean Aramaic, Syriac Aramaic, Syriac. He could read and write many of these archaic languages. Germans are like that. And he decided to look at the Quran, and he noticed that he was coming across the beautiful poetry. As he was looking at these beautiful poetry, a good bit of the Quran is poetry, and this is why Muslims say this is what makes it. How could a man who could not read and write such beautiful poetry? That's how it is proof that it is divine. It is from God himself. But as he's looking at this poetry, he said, well, I've seen that before. And so he started looking at and taking off the dots and replacing them with other dots. Because see, Arabic is not the first to have dots. Your language, Aramaic, has dots, does it not, Habib? Aramaic is what was spoken in the Christian churches. It was what was used in the lectionaries. It was what was used in the liturgy in the 7th century. All of the Christians, the Nestorians, all wrote and read in Aramaic, and they would write these beautiful poems. And as he started taking the dots off from the Arabic and putting Aramaic dots on, he was able to come up and find that every one of these strophes that he found were Christian hymns to Jesus Christ, our Lord. So he wrote it up in his doctoral thesis. So he got this Eximium Opus in 1970. Now, when you get an Eximium Opus, you are given any professorship anywhere in Germany. If you get the highest grade, anybody wants you, everybody wants you, and you're given a professorship. He didn't get a professorship. He was thrown out of the university in 1972 and was thrown into obscurity for 30 years, had to live on welfare. I met him in 1999. I didn't by accident. I was going to meet another German scholar, Dr. Gunther, who is one who's doing all this amazing work on the Sanaa manuscript. And when I was there, he said, I want you to meet this man named Gunther Luling. And so he invited me over to his house, and we met him, and he had knickerbockers on. He was a jovial fellow. And I said, well, what did you do your doctorate on? And he told me that he did it on these Christian hymns. I said, Christian hymns in the Quran? Can I see your doctorate? So he handed me, it was about that thick. And I said, well, why don't you get this translated into English? We'd love to read this. He says, well, why don't you do it for me? So I took it back to London and got it translated. Paid for it. I couldn't do the translation. I had the Germans do it there, and they translated into English. We handed it back to him, and that's the end of the story, I thought. I didn't know what happened after that. In the last 3 months, I have been going up and I've been bringing a German scholar of sorts. His name is Thomas Alexander. Thomas Alexander is from Germany. He's part of the INADA group, which is these German scholars that include Dr. Robert Kerr, Dr. Christoph Luxemburg, used to include Dr. Gunther Luling, and many others, Gerd Puin, von Bothmer, Oleg, all these great names. These are the best and the brightest in the world when it comes to the Quran. These are all the German scholars. They're way ahead of the rest of the world. But Thomas saw me on my internet site, and he wanted to get in contact with me. He says, Jay, we have some stuff in Germany that you'd like to hear. And I said, well, yes. He said, we have been tabulating this material since 1920. That means for 100 years they've been tabulating this, but they've been keeping it in German. And I said, well, let's get it in English. So he said, okay, invite me on. So I invited him on. If you go up on Fandor Films, you'll see in October, November, and December, he started coming on and started introducing all this material. And then he came to Gunther Luling. He says, you know, this guy named Gunther Luling blew this whole thing open in 1970, was thrown into obscurity, and then he got an English translation that actually brought him out of obscurity, and he died in 2015, absolved, because the whole world now could read his work. And I said, well, I think I had something to do with that. Says, you're the one that translated into English? I said, yeah, I didn't know what happened to it. Says, well, because of what you did, Gunther Luling died a happy man. And I said, well, tell me what he showed. Tell me what he did. Well, he said, not only did they resurrect what Gunther Luling did, Dr. Christoph Luxemburg then wrote this book. Have any of you seen this book? Grab it, get it, Put it in your library. You should know what this is, hubby, because this is your language. Dr. Christoph Luxem is not his real name. He cannot tell you what his real name is because of fear of death. There are so many Muslims that would like to kill him for what he has found. He decided to go one step further from Dr. Luling, and he decided to go and look at these Arabic texts, and then he applied a methodology, 7 different ways of peeling back the layers from the text to find what was underneath. Let me just go through the 7 very quickly. The first thing he did is he went to look at the words in Al-Tabari's tafsir, his commentary in the Arabic. That was from the 10th century. If he couldn't find any help there, then he went to the 13th century to Ibn Manzur's dictionary in Arabic. If that didn't help, then he went to what they call homonymous Aramaic roots, looking for roots in Aramaic, in your language. And if that didn't work, then they went and started pulling off the diacritical, the dots off the Arabic. And then number 5, he then went into looking at Aramaic, replacing it with Aramaic dots, your language. And then he started finding enormous amount of discoveries. And what he was doing, he was pinpointing the 25% of the Quran that I said at the very beginning of the hour, even the scholars didn't know. He was only interested in those 25% known as the dark passages that even the scholars could not understand. As he was peeling layer after layer, he then took the diacritical marks, applied Aramaic diacritical marks to them, looked for translations from Arabic to Aramaic, and then finally he went back to the Aramaic lexicons from the 10th century and was able to reproduce all of the dark passages. Every one of the dark passages, and guess what he found? Every one of these dark passages that's in the Quran today are previously Aramaic Christian lectionaries. All about Jesus Christ. It's all about Jesus. The original Quran, the Proto Quran, was written by these Christians who were priests. Many of them were writing these. They were beautiful poems. There's a beautiful poem from Ephraim, a poem that is in chapter 23 of the Quran. Read it. You can see it. Look at the first 5 verses in chapter 23 of the Quran. It talks about the duties of the believer, how the believer must not at all use foul language, how he must pay his debts, how he must pray, and finally it says how he must remain chaste. Verse 5, how he must remain chaste. And then verse 6 comes in. Except for those men who have multiple wives and who have sex slaves. Woo! Slams you right in the face. What's that got to do with chastity? And then in verse 8, it continues with the believers who do these, great shall be their reward in paradise. Dr. Guillaume D. from France went back and traced this, did the same thing that Christoph Luxemburg had done, gone back to the Aramaic and found that this is a hymn, this is a beautiful poem written by St. Ephraim in the 4th century. It's all about what a believer is until you get to the word chaste. Verse 6 and 7 are not in the Aramaic at all. That is an adulteration of the text by the Arabs who didn't know how to read Aramaic. They adulterated it and took chastity and just destroyed the whole intent of what chastity was to be. And you can see example after example after example right through the Quran. So folks, what are we going to do? We need to go back and take the Quran and bring it home. Bring it back to its Aramaic. And you've got an Aramaic speaker in your church. You've got a treasure here. We've got to take it back to its original language, to its original intent. We've got to take it back to Jesus. The Quran in its original form. Now can you see why all this adulteration is all through the Quran? What it does to women. Look at the violence all the Quran. That is not there in the original text. That has been adulterated by the Arabs, who then later became Muslims and imposed their agenda. It all happened during the Abbasid period from 749 on. This we've just found out. And the Germans are the ones who have discovered it, and the head of all this group, Dr. Robert Kerr, has now agreed to come on Fander Films starting this month. He's going to unpack all the new material that I've not even heard yet. It just gets better and better. Now, can you see what I've just done in this last hour? I've taken a book, this one here, that claims to be eternal, and I've taken another book that doesn't claim to be eternal. This book claims to be eternal, uncreated, not fettered by human hands. This book doesn't claim to be eternal, is written by humans, inspired by God. In just 1 hour, looking internally and externally, I have proven to you that this book is not eternal. This book was not sent down to a man between 610 and 622. This book was not completed in 652 by a man named Uthman. This book has changed over and over and again. This book has gone from 7 down to 1 to 30 and back down to 1 again, proving it has human intervention all the way through. It is as human a book. This book was originally lectionaries, homilies, and hymns, Christian lectionaries, homilies, and hymns to Jesus Christ. And it has been adulterated by Islam. Can you see why we need to get this book and bring it home again? And what do you think they're going to find? Oh, who do you think they're going to find? His name is Jesus. Okay, time for questions.
Well, first of all, can we give Dr. Smith a hand, please? I don't know about you, but I'm sure that many of us feel like we've just kind of imbibed a whole language and culture and story that we're not used to, and it's overwhelming, but I think that's a good exercise for a lot of us, and thank you for that. Appreciate it. And so we're going to, some people have voted these questions up, so you've voted the questions, and I'm going to ask you the questions, and we can have a little conversation if you'd like. You can tell us some more about this. One of the questions that got voted up was this: how are the 26 different Qur'ans with the 93,000 contradictions different than the many different Bible translations with different words?
Okay, real quickly. Translations, we're not talking about translations. Translations are different languages. We're talking about the Arabic text. So basically, how can you have, what I'm saying is, we have 30 different Hebrew Old Testaments, and we have 30 different Greek New Testaments. Okay, don't get in translations this. This has nothing to do with translation. These are the original text. Now, how are they different? You want to see?
Yes.
Well, actually, I could go through some slides right here. You can see right here, I've got some slides just on that. If you look here, take a look at this. This is chapter 3, verse 146. So this is not a translation, folks. These are both Arabic. All right? Two different examples of one verse in two different Qurans, one in Warsh and one in Hafs. So that's these two books I have up here at the front. Okay? On the left side you have Hafs, which is the word qatala, means to fight. And on the right side you have qutila, which means we're killed. So in the English translation of this Arabic word, verse, how many a prophet fought with whom were many worshippers of the Lord? On the Warsh it says, how many a prophet were killed with whom were many worshippers of the Lord? What have they done? They have put a dhamma in where the fatha was, and they have put a kasra where the other fatha was. So that's all they did, was change two vowels around, and look at, you have now fought versus kill. How does that change the verse? Well, if you're a prophet, I like to rather fight rather than be killed, wouldn't you think? So you can see this changes whether or not the prophet lives or not. Here's another example. Here you have slaves on the left versus in the presence of God. Are you slaves or are you in the presence of God? And are you females who are in the presence of God? Well, you can see just by changing two different letters here, you get a completely different meaning on that. I won't go into that because that has three different problems here. Here you have Ihsan on the left, and you have Husnan. One is doing good, the other is beauty. Translation, and we have enjoined on a man doing good to his parents. On the right side, we have enjoined on man beauty. Now, if I'm a parent and I have 3 sons, do we want our sons to do good or to be beautiful? I'd rather they be good rather than good looking. And then we'll end with this one here, 98:6. Here you have between the Warsh and the Hafs, al-barayati versus al-bara'ati. One means creatures. That means creatures who are in hell. And look who they are. Those are the people of the scripture. That's us and the polytheists. Are we creatures in hell or are we innocent? Now there's a theological problem and a doctrinal problem. Do you see that? Just by changing one of the letters, you change the complete doctrine. Because are we creatures in hell because of what we did, or are we innocent in hell? And if we're innocent, what are we doing in hell? So you can see there's all kinds. You can do a doctoral thesis on that. So it doesn't just change. This has nothing to do with translation. These are Arabic with Arabic, Greek with Greek, Hebrew with Hebrew, the equivalent in the Bible. And yet look how they change just by changing a dot or changing a vowel.
Thank you. Good. Yes. Wow. Another great answer and interesting. Somebody voted this one up. Who discovered the Qur'an? I'm not sure if you covered that at the beginning. I can't remember. So who discovered the Qur'an? There's 5 votes for that question.
I have no idea who discovered the Qur'an because we can't find the Qur'an. If we could find the first Qur'an, we'd know who discovered it. That's the million-dollar question no one knows. Okay. What we do know is a good bit of it. You should remember I showed you the top copy, the very first one, the one that was 99%, and it's from 749. It has 2,270 variants from the Quran we have today. That means, is that the Quran with over 2,000 differences? So where is this Quran that we're talking about? Well, this is it right here. This is the Hafs text. When was this written? This was written in 796. That's the late 8th century. That's 144 years after Muhammad, but chosen in 1924, less than 100 years ago. So is this the original Quran? Well, you're 144 years out, and of course, you're almost 1,400 years too late, or 1,300 years too late. So who has created the Quran? I would suggest we won't know that until we find more manuscripts that will lead us to how and where the Hafs came from.
Good, thank you. Yes. I think that point's been made over and over again that there's just so many Qurans that it's kind of hard to distinguish, and that is kind of the proving point against there being this eternal word that you've been mentioning. And so, nonetheless...
Let me just say real quickly,
yeah,
Dr. Shadi Nasser from Harvard University did his doctoral thesis on this very question. He wanted to find out whether these 30 official Qurans were just the only ones. And he went back to all the traditions and found that no. There were over 700 different Qurans. 700 different Qurans from which these 30 were chosen. 7 were chosen in 936, that's the 10th century. Another 14 were chosen by Al-Sha'atibi in 1194, that's the 12th century. And then another 9 were chosen by Al-Jaziri in, listen to the date, 1429, that is the 15th century. That's 800 years after Muhammad. So the 30 Qurans that we have today, chosen from the 700, were only finalized 800 years after Muhammad. Ooh, It just gets better and better.
I like that sound. That's good.
That's my signature piece. I do that. All the Muslims know it, and they don't like it when they hear it.
Good. So a couple other questions, just a few more. Here's one. How do you take all of this challenging knowledge about the Quran that you've shared tonight and share it in a way that Muslims will listen to? Like, how do you do that, and how can you engage? That's kind of the idea of like taking all this knowledge. Let's just put it into a conversation quickly, or some way that you can talk to somebody and use this in a conversation if you're talking to a Muslim person.
Very simply, and this is what we're going to do. On Saturday, we're going to introduce some new material on Mecca and also on Muhammad. If you think the Quran is bad, wait till you see what we know about Mecca and Muhammad. But what you do is what we find in conversation with Muslims, whenever they make a claim about the Quran, the Quran is eternal. All you have to do is ask 2 words, prove it. But don't prove it from the 9th and 10th and 11th and 12th century, prove it from the 7th century. Where is this Quran that you're talking about? Simple as that. It makes it so much easier. Now notice what I have said. I have asked a historical question. So by asking a historical question, say, prove it. Show me one manuscript of this book you're talking about that's, you're saying 1,400 years. Show me one example of one manuscript from that century and leave it with them. But more than that, prove it that it has not been changed. When you say not one word, not one letter, prove it. Just say prove it. And what's fascinating, by asking these type of historical questions, this is not hate speech, this is not Islamophobia, you won't get struck off. And more than that, you are asking a perfectly neutral question because the same questions have been asked of the Bible. And we've passed every one of those tests.
That's great. Thank you. So that's a great tool just for you guys to use as you do engage people, right? Just ask that question, prove it. I think that's super helpful. Thank you. one other thing, somebody put this, are the stories from the Old Testament the same stories in the Quran?
Absolutely not. And this is why it's so tragic, because there's so many stories in the Quran that do not parallel our biblical stories. There's many characters that are there. I'm going to give you one, for example. Chapter 27, verse 17 in the Quran is a story of Solomon and Sheba. Now, see if this is the same Solomon you know in your Bible. According to that story, Solomon has birds that he marches and gets ready for battle because they fly up over the enemy and they drop stones on the enemy with the name engraved on the bottom of the stone that they're going to kill. So he's marching the birds one day, left, right, and he notices the hoopoe bird's missing. He gets angry because the hoopoe bird's missing. And then suddenly he looks to the south and he sees the hoopoe bird flying and it lands at his feet and talks to him. So Solomon talks to birds. Is that in your Bible? Solomon able to talk to birds? Anyhow, he's talking to the bird and says, where have you been? And the hoopoe bird says, well, I've been down in the south, way down in Sheba, in Sabaean area, and there's this gorgeous queen down there, the Queen of Sheba. You've got to see her. Well, Solomon tells bird, you go on back down, bring her back up, and I'm going to keep marching my bird. So the bird flaps on back down to Sheba, lands at the feet of the Queen of Sheba, and talks to her. So lo and behold, she talks to birds. I guess in 1900 BC, everybody talks to birds back then. But not my Bible, but according to the Quran, she then comes up to Jerusalem, comes into the doorway, and Solomon is sitting on his throne, and she comes to the doorway. As she's walking across, there's a pond, a puddle, like a little pond in between, and she realizes she's going to have to walk through it, and so she picks up her skirts to keep them from getting wet. That's where it ends in verse 77. Have you heard that story in your Bible?
Absolutely not.
Boy, I wish I had that in Sunday school. So where does this story come from? This does not come from the Bible. This comes from the Second Talmud of Sheba, written in the 2nd century. It's in a Jewish apocryphal account. It was written as a bedtime tale for their children, just putting biblical names onto it. But that had no right to be in any revelation from God, yet it was stuck in probably the 8th or 9th century because it was the only ones they had access to. And almost every one of the stories, when you look at the Quran, are these abbreviated, these abrogated, and these apocryphal accounts.
Thank you.
Proving yet again, written by men.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's it's really interesting, this whole conversation tonight, because I think that you are touching on something that it's kind of foreign for us in our culture today to even like speak against or say something that might even be true. It might sound kind of like hate speech, like you said, but asking these historical questions and actually pointing people to historical realities is not hate speech. It's just actually having a conversation and a dialogue about facts. And so really appreciate that you're doing that.
Let me just say one real quickly. There are a lot of people who do confront Muhammad and do confront his sexual proclivities and his violence. And that's what Muslims get upset about. They don't want you to touch Muhammad. So don't go there. Don't even talk about his sexual problems. Who cares? Don't even talk about his violence. Who cares? Ask a much deeper question. Did he exist? Bingo. If he didn't even exist, then who cares about all these stories? But what you're doing is two things. You're taking this anger away, and you're never going to be called a hate preacher. I don't get called hate preacher anymore, or Islamophobe, because I don't do that anymore. I let David Wood and Hatuntash and Sam Shamoun do that. I stick to the historical argument. Once you do that, it's not only neutral, it's much more impactful, and you're actually confronting the very foundations.
Oh, that's so good. Okay, one more question, and I think this is a great place to end tonight. It says, what are the references, or are there references of Jesus Christ that are in the Quran?
Lots of references, about 93. You want me to go through all of them?
Maybe just a couple, I don't know.
Let me just give you the ones that are probably the most problematic. In chapter 4, verse 171, it says that, say not three, for God is one and he has no son. So it's attacking the Trinity, it's attacking Jesus' divinity, and it's attacking his sonship all in one verse. But chapter 5 is probably the most difficult one for Jesus. In chapter 5, verse 72, it says, for God has no partners. That's attacking the fact that Jesus is a partner of God. In chapter 5, verse 75, it says that Mary and Jesus ate, but God does not eat, attacking the fact that therefore Jesus cannot be God because God doesn't eat. In chapter 5, verse 116, it's God asking Isa, is it true that you and your mother ought to be worshipped as God? So that's attacking the Trinity again, but it's confusing Mary as part of the Trinity. So in all four of those, has no partner, does not eat, and also is is one of the part of the Trinity with his mother. Can you see these are all aberrations? Not one of these three things do we believe. They do not represent Christianity. So whoever wrote the Qur'an, how did they get it so wrong? Unless, of course, these are Aramaic writings that have been adulterated when they put it into Arabic. That's what we're finding. The Jesus there, and then you get probably the last, and this is the last one, this is the worst one. Chapter 4, verse 157. In chapter 4, verse 157, it says, "For they killed him not," this is Jesus, "they thought it was so, another was given his image, but truly they did not crucify him." And that's why Muslims don't believe Jesus was crucified. That one verse damns us all to eternity. How did that get in there? Here we're finding that's not one of the earliest verses. That's not in the original manuscripts. That was added at a later date. So historically speaking, we know that this had nothing to do with the original Quran. It was added as a polemic against Jesus. Because the earlier verses in chapter 19, verse 33, there you see Jesus himself, Isa, talking about himself as a child. And you see, "Blessed be me, the day I was born, the day I die, and the day I rise again." He's talking about his death. That contradicts chapter 4, verse 157. So the earlier verses, which are in the earlier Quran, the Proto-Quran, are all right. They got Jesus correct. But the later ones destroy his divinity, destroy his sonship, and most importantly, take him off the cross and let another die in his place.
Well, thank you. We are going to close for tonight, and hopefully you guys have enjoyed this little bit of a preview of the conference coming up on the weekend. Had your mind blown a little bit. I think, Habil, you said that in our advertisement for the conference, that once you listen to Dr. Smith, your mind kind of gets blown a little bit, and I think that's true. I do just want to say that I think it's really, really helpful, and this is why. If you look in the Bible in the book of Acts in chapter 17, what you see is Paul engaging on what was called the Areopagus or Mars Hill. And when he was there, as many of you guys know, he was able to quote some of the writings of their own scholars and their own poets, and he does this in the book of Titus as well, right? And so as we listen tonight, we're somewhat maybe familiar with some Greek philosophers because some of us have taken philosophy in college or in other places like that, and so we'll hear some of these things and it'll make sense. This is a whole nother world. This is a world with a different culture and narrative, and so it's helpful, and I didn't get exposed to much of this until I moved to England, where, as you said, in England there are many more Muslims. And it can seem to some irrelevant, but I'll say this, that online it's not irrelevant. In Boise, populations are growing, and we have neighbors and friends that are immersed in this world that Dr. Smith has opened up for us tonight and will open up further over the weekend. And so I just want to encourage you that the motivation behind this whole thing is to open up this world, to open up these histories, open up these stories so that we might be able to know people and engage in their story. And you can't engage in their story without knowing their story, and that's what this is all about. And so thank you so much again, Dr. Smith. We appreciate you. One more hand for Dr. Smith tonight.